I'm Bill Wilson, welcoming you to another exciting adventure on Wild Cargo, the program that brings man-sized adventure right into your living room. Now, these are not fictional episodes, but true life experiences of two men, Arthur Jones and Bill Carpenter. Arthur Jones, during his career as a cameraman, big game hunter, and trapper, has brought back into captivity more forms of wild animal and reptile life than any man alive. Where does our adventure take us? To Africa, Asia, or the jungles of the Amazon? We'll see in just a moment when we join Arthur Jones on Wild Cargo. Arthur, we've had many exciting and varied hunts with you in past episodes, but this time you're going back to Africa to hunt for big game, but for another purpose, the tsetse fly. Now, why are you so interested in the tsetse fly?
Actually, Bill, the tsetse fly and certain other types of insects have probably caused more damage to human beings and to domestic livestock in Africa and in other sections of the tropical world than all of the so-called dangerous big game animals put together. In certain areas, it has been necessary to completely eradicate all of the wildlife in order to control the tsetse fly, which, of course, as you know, carries the sleeping sickness. In one particular area and on one particular occasion, one man, for example, killed more than 3,000 rhinoceros in one area where they were moving a number of native settlements, and it was necessary to eradicate the game in this section in order to eliminate the carrier of the tsetse fly and thereby, of course, the spreader of sleeping sickness. Now, on this particular occasion, we were involved in a situation where our help was called on to eradicate certain types of wildlife in an area, actually in a thin belt of country, in order to control the spread of sleeping sickness. And by the way, this is a control measure which is going on even today on a very large scale in a number of countries in Africa.
Okay, that sounds interesting, Art. So let's roll into our first segment of today's adventure on Wild Cargo.
After having moved our equipment from one place to another and establishing a new camp, one of the problems that we always have to go through is that of re-sighting in our telescopically sighted rifles. Now, due to the fact that the telescope sights on a rifle are adjustable and are not permanently attached to the gun, in moving from one place to another, it's almost inevitable that these sights will be moved, perhaps microscopically, but nevertheless an amount that could be important when sighting at a very small target from a great distance. Not only is it important that these sights be very accurately adjusted, but they must be adjusted by the person who actually intends to use that particular rifle. A gun which has been sighted in with telescopic sights by one person will not necessarily be accurate when used by another person. Now, this particular rifle that my partner, Bill Carpenter, was sighting in at this moment had apparently been jostled a bit in being moved in the Land Rover, and the first sight at a measured 100 yards on the sandbank was about 3 inches below the dead center mark on the target. Now, depending, of course, upon the type of game you intend to hunt and the distances at which you intend to fire upon this game, the setting upon this rifle naturally will vary from one situation to another. But normally we sight our guns in for a distance of about 100 yards directly on the target. And of course, naturally, this will give you a slight low sighting at a greater distance or a slight high sighting at a shorter distance. Now, one of the guns which we do not practice shoot is the double 600 for very good and obvious reasons. Our boy Francis Lindsay here from South Africa, had never having fired a heavy double rifle, was interested in seeing exactly what would happen, and he found out very quickly. Now, the reason for not doing practice firing with a heavy rifle is the fact that having done so and been knocked down or having your shoulder dislocated by a rifle of this caliber in practice firing, the natural tendency is for a man to flinch when he uses the rifle under field conditions. And due to the fact that the iron sights on this rifle are not adjustable or movable, and the gun normally is used at very close range in any case, it's not necessary really to do so. And in order to avoid the possibility, or I might say the probability, of developing a very bad flinch when using this rifle, it's only used in actual conditions in the field. At this point, as I mentioned, the real purpose of this trip was to attempt to eradicate or frighten out, I might use the term educate, all of a certain type of animals in a very narrow strip of country. The animals that we were interested in either killing or removing were animals that could serve as hosts for the tsetse fly, which, among other things, is a carrier of the dread sleeping sickness disease. Now, not only does the tsetse fly carry sleeping sickness, which affects not only wild animals, but domestic animals and human beings as well, but also it is a very great scourge in certain places in Africa for people that are attempting to raise beef and milk cattle. These flies attack the cattle in very large numbers. They're a blood-drinking fly. The fly is quite large. He has a tremendous appetite, and when they attack a herd of dairy cattle, it practically puts the entire herd out of operation in a matter of a few days. Our prime purpose here, as I mentioned, was to attempt to remove these animals. Actually, we were not interested in having to kill the animals. In the first place, this would be completely impossible to kill all of the animals in an area being bordered by abundant game areas on all sides. In other words, if we killed out all of the animals in this section, the animals on the sides would merely move back in. So although, of course, it was impossible to actually achieve the 100% performance of this particular duty, nevertheless, we hoped that by killing some of the more stubborn types or stubborn individuals, we would in turn educate the others and achieve the same result. I might point out that in certain sections of Africa, it has been necessary literally to slaughter tens of thousands of some types of animals to achieve this result. One man in particular, in a matter of about 3 years, personally killed more than 5,000 individual rhinos in one section of Africa alone. The big buffalo, the Cape buffalo of Africa, is one of your worst problems encountered in this type of control hunting, and of course the double 600 rifle is the meat for this particular type of animal. Now, when using a heavy rifle in the field, although of course the jolt is no less, the recoil is just the same, nevertheless, when you're actually using the gun in the field, you are so concentrating on what you're shooting at that normally you don't notice it until sometime later that day. Stubborn types, and one of the larger and more interesting types of antelope found in that section of Africa in great numbers are the wildebeest. In some places I have to report, unfortunately, that large numbers of game have been slaughtered for one worthwhile purpose or another, but the carcasses have been left in the field to rot, and it was our intent, and under the circumstances we were able to remove more than 90% of the resulting meat from the kills that it was necessary for us to make on this particular hunt. Of course, maintaining a staff of more than 100 men in our own employ at that moment, we were able to use considerable amounts of the meat ourselves. But not being able to eat in the quantities that we were producing the meat, our own men not being able to eat these quantities, the rest of it was distributed to natives in that section.
I think we can see, Art, that there are more things to hunts and to African adventure than just the adventure of the kill. And we'll see more of our adventure on Wild Cargo in just a moment. Art, it would appear that the impossible is being attempted here. Now, I can't imagine anything outside of complete eradication of the entire animal kingdom of Africa, how you could control the tsetse fly.
Well, complete control of the tsetse fly probably never will be achieved. What we were trying to do is to eradicate certain types of animals within a narrow belt of land. Now, the idea, of course, is obvious that if we eradicate these animals, then we have stopped the carrying agent for the sleeping sickness, the tsetse fly. Now, one thing that might not meet the eye of the casual observer is the fact that when you have eradicated a narrow belt of animals around an area or separating one area from another, you have achieved a more worthwhile purpose than it might appear on the surface, due to the fact that in eradicating certain numbers of the animals, you have educated the rest of the animals, so that in this narrow belt of land, the animals bordering it on both sides will be so terrified for their lives that they simply will not cross into the area of eradication for a period of some months or even years. Now, obviously, it would be impossible to kill all of the wildlife, and of course this wouldn't be a worthwhile project even if it were possible. And we were not attempting to do this. But when you go into an area of this type, for work of this type, the purpose is to kill those animals that insist upon remaining and to drive out the remainder. And in driving them out, as I mentioned a moment ago, you educate them to the dangers to be found. Now, certain types of wild animals become educated very rapidly. I've mentioned in the past that when you go into an area to catch crocodiles, you catch a few and educate the rest. Of course, the same thing applies to the others. When they realize that to stay in a certain area means sure death, then they move out. And then of course, you have accomplished the purpose that you set out to do. And you do this without having to kill all of the animals, but actually only a small number of them. You achieve the same overall purpose.
Well, I'm anxious to be further educated, Art, so let's roll into the second segment of our filmed adventure in Africa on Wild Cargo.
Now, while we were operating out of a fairly permanently established base camp, it was necessary, in order to cover the amount of terrain that we had to cover, to establish outlying camps some distance from our main camp. In order to do this, of course, we were relying upon the use of our Land Rovers and our tents. Now, moving into a new area, we set up our tents, established temporary camps, and then would operate out of them for a period of 3 or 4 days and then move on to another spot. Now, in setting up a tent, of course, it's necessary to clear the ground around it for a considerable distance. Otherwise, you wake up in the middle of the night with rather disconcerting bed mates at times. Although I'm an admirer of snakes and have collected them for a number of years, I don't like to find one in the middle of the bed with me at night. And for that matter, I'm not an admirer of insects, and I don't like to find them in the middle of the night in the middle of my bed either. Speaking of insects, you might notice that practically any place in Africa, it is necessary to use a mosquito net, and we always carry these with us. Although they do not have mosquitoes in Africa in the numbers, or at least I've never encountered them in the numbers in Africa that we have them here in certain sections of Louisiana. Nevertheless, we're not blessed with sleeping sickness, which of course isn't carried by the mosquito, or malaria, or certain other diseases, yellow fever included, which are carried by some of the African mosquitoes. So we have to be a little careful with the African mosquitoes, even though they might not bother us after coming from this part of the world. Now, another type of operation that we attempted here, and one which I might point out didn't work out too well, was to attempt to frighten the animals out of the section. Now, although I have been a hunter, a professional hunter, most of my life, and in the course of doing so, of course, have killed large numbers of animals. Although my partner, Bill Carpenter, has spent a great deal of his life in hunting activities, either professionally or for the purpose of sport. And although in the course of these years, both of us, of course, of necessity, have killed large numbers of various types of animals, nevertheless, it goes distinctly against the grain for both of us to kill animals if no worthwhile purpose is being achieved. And in spite of the fact that this trip was for a worthwhile purpose, nevertheless, it entailed the killing of animals in numbers that were a little sickening to both of us. So we were attempting to use all possible methods to achieve the end here without having to rely upon the final solution of butchery. Now, in this particular instance, we were attempting to frighten the animals out of the section by employing large numbers of natives and driving the game. Of course, driving the game can be done for a number of reasons and a number of ways. Normally it's done as a method of catching or killing an animal to drive them forward towards the hunters. We were doing it here in an effort to frighten them away. However, we found, after a few days of this, a considerable amount of trouble and no small expense, that the animals reached a point where they were completely blasé about the pounding upon cans and the shrieking natives. And the fact of the matter is, I sincerely believe that we merely succeeded in taming the animals, whereas in the past they had been a little shy about people sneaking around in the bush. After a period of a few days of people running back and forth, blowing horns, honking, and pounding on cans and screaming, eventually they got the idea that all of this noise was actually not doing them any damage, and it got to the point that the animals were easier to approach and less likely to leave the area than they had been in the past. So in the long run, we were forced by circumstances to go back to the original solution of killing a certain number of the animals and educating the rest. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we made use of the meat and in some cases of the hides of the animals. In this particular instance, we were interested not only in obtaining the meat of the zebra, but also, of course, in taking the hide. Although the hides of most African game are of no use other than as a trophy, the zebra is such a remarkable trophy that we take every advantage to obtain their hides to bring back to this country. At this point, we had retained the services of our native hunter, Akanuncia, as a skinner to prepare certain of the animals as trophies and for the production of leather. Akanuncia, of course, having been a professional hunter in his own right and in his own way for a number of years, was very well experienced at skinning out and preparing the hides of all types of African game. After having tried a number of times unsuccessfully, and eventually, in a very short time, having been successful on 2 occasions, completely unexpectedly, we encountered an opportunity, or rather I might say a necessity, to bring down yet another elephant using a pistol. We encountered one that had been seriously wounded, and under the circumstances, although he was not included in our normal line of tsetse fly hunting, we were forced by the situation to put an end to his suffering. You might notice the end of the trunk of this animal. He had been seriously wounded by a native hunter and gotten in such poor shape that he had been attacked by some large cat or possibly even hyenas, and the end of his trunk had been eaten off.
Art, you always bring us something exciting and entertaining and, as you can see now, also educational. Now, we'll be back in just a moment with that portion of the program I think Art enjoys most, and that is keeping me on edge with a visitor in the studio, be it a wild animal or reptile. We'll see what it is in just a moment when we rejoin Art on Wild Cargo. We are preparing a trip to outer space. These goggles are merely a simple safety precaution against what many experts consider the most dangerous animal alive, one that can kill without even touching you. Now, this is what Art has told me, and I trust it because I'm not going to get any closer than necessary to find out. Art, what is this?
This is the African ringgulls, or spitting cobra, Bill. And as you mentioned, this is not only one of, but probably the most dangerous animal that ever lived on the face of the globe. Certainly he is probably the only animal that can actually kill an enemy without touching him. Mm-hmm. Of course, there are lots of stories about porcupines throwing their quills, which they do not do. However, this animal is perfectly capable of, and with willful intent, will spit his venom at the eyes of an enemy. And by the way, he can hit a standing man in the eyes from a distance of 8 to 10 feet. And he purposely directs this venom directly at the eyes. Now, he's spitting now. You can see some of the venom sprayed out here in front of him. It isn't just a matter of throwing the venom out in your general direction, and by slight chance some of it striking the eyes, but rather he aims the venom directly at the eyes. His aim is very accurate, and in spite of his small size, he can send it far enough away to hit a man standing at an average distance that you'd encounter one of these things.
Doesn't he know that's impolite to spit?
Probably.
Is this as big as they get, Art?
This is about an average-sized individual here. This one is about 3 feet in length and weighs just a little over a pound, but this is about an average-sized individual. I might point out, by the way, that this animal is completely unlike other cobras in that he has keeled scales. You'll notice he has a heavy ridge down the center of each scale. All of the other members of the cobra family have smooth scales. Also, another difference in this animal is that he gives birth to living young, whereas the rest of the cobras lay eggs, and there are certain other differences as well. Most of the cobras have a rounded, rather non-distinct head. This one has a rather short, blunt, and a fairly wide head. Now, I'm not concerning describing the hood at the moment. Of course, he has the hood, like all cobras, but I'm speaking now entirely about the shape of the head itself. A number of years ago, I had one of these in my hotel room in Oklahoma City, and some busybody down the hall reported it to the police department, and one of the local policemen came up there at a time when I was out, and he later reported to the newspapers that, yes, it was certainly a cobra, that he would know a cobra anywhere, having been in India during the war. And at the time, I remarked that you could have had a water snake in the cage in the room, and he would have reported the same thing, because that's actually what the ringgalls looks like. He has all of the characteristics of our own local harmless water snakes, and he looks completely unlike a cobra in any respect. In other words, he has none of the features of the common cobras at all. So this great expert that had been in India during the war there, of course, was interested in publicity only. Now, of course, it was a cobra in that case, but you couldn't have proven it by him, believe me. Now, not only can this snake spit his venom, but of course he bites like all of the other members of the cobra family, and being a neurotoxic snake, his venom is very dangerous, and a bite from this snake is normally fatal to an average-sized human being.
How quick would this bite take effect? Or the venom if it was thrown into your eye?
Actually, there has been a lot of discussion about exactly what happens if you're spat in the eye by one of these animals. But certain people have lost their eyesight for shorter or longer periods of time, and in certain instances, I believe there are actual cases of people having died from the venom being spat into their eye. And of course, it is a very dangerous thing. The eye, of course, contains mucous membrane, and this venom is absorbable through the mucous membrane.
Very interesting, Art, and very exciting, and I can't say that I'm not going to be very pleased to lead us now into a preview of our next adventure on Wild Cargo.
Next week, Bill, we take you back to Africa, this time for a little different expedition. In next week's trip, we're in pursuit of native game poachers.
Art, I don't know how you do it, but it looks like our next adventure on Wild Cargo is going to be even more exciting. We hope you'll be with us. We'll be back with Arthur Jones on Wild Cargo.